Well, good evening. We're looking at the character of Moses. If you want to go ahead and open up your Bibles to chapter 11 of Exodus. Glad you could join us. If you're online and you're live with us, please contribute through the comments. And I'm sitting here looking at them so I can respond to them and engage with you. So far, last week we looked in a lot more detail in analyzing just the plagues themselves and how they lined up against all the gods of Egypt, which is very important because that's exactly what God is trying to do. God has never demonstrated something like this before, at least it's recorded, where God has directly shown himself in this way to one Moses. Whenever Moses met God, God pretty much told him, who his name was, I am. And because before that, he was just the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so now he's manifested himself in a way that showing the world that, all these other gods that you have tried to create are just manifestations in your mind of things that are nature themselves. They're all natural. You're just trying to take something that you think is amazing. I mean, if you think of the ocean, it's powerful, it's wonderful, it's amazing. And then they take that type of an attribute and they look at something natural and they go, man, there must be some force that is controlling that. And that is what man always does. When you suppress God, you replace him. And that's given. I mean, you suppress God, the one true God, you will replace him with something. So these are all the different gods. And we went through last week one by one and didn't read the verses and all the text around those, and we're not going to tonight. What I want to do tonight is I want to take the 9th and the 10th and then go into looking at the 10th, because the 10th is very important in a lot of ways, and we'll look at the 10th. But when we talk about these, I want us to remember that the biggest thing is every god that Egypt had and worshiped and revered have been decisively defeated. The ultimate one, of course, is Pharaoh himself. The god Ra, which was the sun god, was also one that was representative in the manifestation of Pharaoh. So Pharaoh, in a sense, was the god of Ra, and he was the sun god, and so he was the most powerful. He's supposed to have power over all the other gods. And so far, he is basically our God, Yahweh, has removed every aspect and control of every one of the gods. And then in its wake, look what happened. It's devastated the nation. It's just devastated them. A couple of other things that I've noticed about the rhythm of them as you go through them. As they're being presented, you'll see Moses will come and confront Pharaoh. And when he starts out, he confronts Pharaoh and he gives him an ultimatum. He says, look, let my people go. We need to go and worship 3 days. And Pharaoh's no. And there's this negotiation that goes on. There's this back and forth where Moses will ask to go and he'll say, no, do this. And Pharaoh's always trying to renegotiate. And then at the end of one of the plagues, and you'll see where another encounter will occur, and Moses again in front of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh gets to the point where he's asking to relent. And I was just kind of scanning through them just now, and it's kind of fascinating because, in the middle of like the gnats and the frogs and those, Moses goes out and makes a public display of praying to God for them to stop. And for example, like the frogs, he asked Pharaoh, do you want them to stop? I can make them stop. And Pharaoh's like, yeah. And he goes, when do you want them to stop? He goes, tomorrow. And he goes, okay. Moses walks out and prays to God that they stop. So it also is highlighting the fact of the importance of Moses as a priest. If you were an Egyptian looking at him, you'd say, this guy actually has the ability to communicate with this other God and get him to do what he wants. This man is saying, punish him with frogs or punish him with the blood and the Nile and all this. And that God of theirs is able to do it, and he's not, our gods can't stop him. And so Moses is being seen in the public eye as the one that's causing them and stopping them. Sometimes you can cause a catastrophe, but can you stop it? And you see where Moses, in some of these, he's been able to go out and publicly say, but every time we find this hardening of the heart. Now, that word hardening of the heart, and again, in the Hebrew, there's different ideas around it, is a pride. There is a pride about this that you see, but then we see God using that pride to help to harden Pharaoh. So I don't want to get wrapped around the idea, but it does keep coming up because sometimes we look at predestiny. Some people say, well, see, God knew from the beginning of the foundations that he was going to bring this Pharaoh here, and he was going to be chosen to be a demonstration that God was going to destroy their nation because he's going to be evil, and that somehow, he had no role in this, the Pharaoh, as far as how his character was going to be, because God set him up that way. No. So when we see that's not what we find is from the text, is that Pharaoh created himself into this proud person. And God is using really his own pride to harden himself back and forth in these. And just like a proud person, they'll have to humble themselves at some point, and you see him relent. And then all of a sudden, he hardens again. And then he relents. And then he hardens again. And, I've always said, God could have just done something so devastating, so amazing, the very first encounter with Moses, and his people could have walked. And Pharaoh could have done nothing. But this is a process, and it's one to do two things. One, to prove all your gods are your imagination. The other one is for the Hebrews, that the Hebrews are going to sit there and they're going to see this and they're going to have to admit, wow, this God of our forefathers, look at what he's doing. And then we see the third thing is we see the segregation of God's people not being affected by most of them. There's some that they do have some effect, but most of them are not being affected by these plagues, but the Egyptians are. And so now think about it. If you're an Egyptian and you're watching all this happen and you're seeing that the Hebrews, who are of a subclass, they're not really, they can't be that good of a people because what are they? They're slaves. And that happens in a lot of nations. If you're a lower class, you should not have the contact and the power to something that great. And look at the technology and the knowledge and all the culture that the Egyptians had and all the gods that they had, all the gods. You'd think that more gods, more better, bad English there, and then one God, that was kind of the way the Romans, the Greeks, and everyone else did. Anyone with a polytheistic type of culture believed that more of these gods were better. And we see that same conflict with the gospel going against the Greek gods. Whenever the gospel went into Greece and against the Romans, that same thing. They're creations of their own images and their own ideas, and God destroys them all. And that's what we see happening. Now, I did find this, and before, because I knew if I got rolling into class, I'd forget about this. But this is a papyrus that they found, pure papyrus that they found, and it's dated close to the same time. And again, I say close to the same time because nobody can really tell for sure exactly when the Exodus occurred. We can come close to about 1200 BC, 1300 BC. This papyrus has been found, and it is in the same timeline, in the same time, written by this guy, Pharaoh, an Egyptian. And what's interesting is it's not written in petroglyphs, the symbols. It's written in a shorthand Egyptian. And on top of that, he lists 10 catastrophic events that occurred to Egypt. Now, so when we say, well, we have no evidence that anything happened, but no, and this is in Norway. I don't know how it got there, but it's in Norway in a museum. But this little piece of papyrus here goes through, and it doesn't call them the plagues. The Bible calls them the plague, but he lists out 10 devastating catastrophes that hit Egypt and around the same time, and they parallel each one of these. So I wanted to share that with you because we're always being told, especially when it comes to, like Noah's Ark, Tower of Babel, and then the 10 plagues, and then the parting of the Red Sea. Myth.
Where's your proof?
Where's your proof? And now they have found Babel. They're finding all these things. They're finding a place actually at the Red Sea, and when we get there, we'll look at a little bit of archaeology of that as well, where It's not where we all think. It's not some natural phenomenon. And I started to watch it this afternoon. I've already seen it once, where this guy goes through and he's what's his name? The Naked Archaeologist on Discovery Channel, and he's on Nat Geo too. And he goes through there and he just naturally uses nature in trying to explain away the supernatural aspect to it. And really, there's a part where you can say, well, and I agree, God absolutely controls nature and could use him, and I think that some of them are. But I think he goes a little too far in trying to explain away some of these because, they're still outside of the bounds of nature. Nature does not act this way and have this ability to control it. And so a lot of those who have tried to minimize how these were being supernatural and to make them into something natural, like the darkness, we're going to talk about that because I want to do 9 and 10, that there was a volcano that erupted off of one of the Greek islands, and it was massive, and that somehow that caused a tidal wave, and it caused darkness, and he goes through and explains all this stuff. And it's like, oh, that's all that was going on. It just happened to be around the same time. And also with the redness, the blood, saying it was some sort of an algae, things like this. It's like, could God use algae to turn it red if that's a biological process? Absolutely, sure. But again, it doesn't matter. It's still the fact that it's God who did them, no matter what he used in this. And I just wanted to share that because I think that's a very important part of it. The one thing in just this little lineup, and it's a terrible chart, as I was sitting here looking at this, I thought, this is terrible. Nobody here, and I know maybe if you're online you can see this, but is looking at, these are also nature. These are things that controlling nature. And God, of course, has created all of these. So I'm just going to go ahead and skip past that one. But when we look at the 10th one, the 9th and the 10th come together. And that's why before we dive off into the 10th and we look at the 9th one, is important because it's darkness. And darkness is something that is significant in life and death, darkness and such. And the way that it strikes them. And the reason is because I want to look at that because when the night in the darkness between 9 and 10, in chapter 11, he talks about telling and instructing the people to go out and to ask all the Egyptians for their money, for their riches and golds and stuff. Because once the death hits, whenever that firstborn hits, they're out. And so that's what's interesting when we look in Exodus and we look at chapter 11. It's a very short chapter. It's like, just kind of in the middle there, like a comment or something. But this darkness that falls over, and Moses stretches out his hand. And this idea of lasting 3 days. Again, there are some things that could have occurred. There are sandstorms that, I can't remember, I forgot the name of them, but they still occur. Huh? Haboobs, where they just roll in, and if you've seen some videos of them, they're spooky looking. They're like thousands of feet high, and they just come in and just take over. And that would also give substance of feel, because it says the idea here is that it was thick. There was a thickness about this darkness. So, and with the devastation of the land and the crops, you could have that. The other idea is how long do you think it took for these 10 plagues in time, months, weeks? How long did it? Does anybody have any idea? Did Moses have all 10 of these happen in a week, 2 weeks? We don't know, do we? There's nothing biblically that says how long between each one of these occurred. Some scholars have said that, this could have been these 10 plagues could have been a process of up to a year, but under a year for sure, looking at the cycle of the seasons and the way that the crops and what he's devastating. So there is a period. It wasn't, in other words, a week. He didn't walk in one day and go, okay, blood, and then come back the next day and go frogs, and then come in the next day and then go gnats, and then come in the next day and go, flies, and then the next day, and by the time you get to day 10, okay, they're gone. No, it probably did not occur. Absolutely, most scholars will say it did not happen in 10 days, 1 day per plague, but it was over an extended period of time. And it does make sense. when you look at the devastation of the livestock as well. And now we're back to, again, where we're going to see the firstborn, including livestock as well, are going to be affected by this. So the darkness is very important when it comes to linking these last two to the top. You notice he starts out with natural things that are being affected. Water, it did affect the people, but when he starts out, it doesn't affect them physically. They're external type of things that's affecting their lifestyle and their livelihood. But then eventually, then we get into the lice, where it's on them, which then shut down the priests. The priests couldn't go in and offer throughout the whole nation. Then we see boils, and they couldn't even come before Pharaoh because of the boils. The only person that was standing before Pharaoh was Moses and Aaron, without any boils. So we see the progression of the way that God is using these and progressing up. And now we're actually coming to Pharaoh, because the Pharaoh was responsible to being the Ra, the God of Ra, and that's the sun. And they looked at the sunrise as it came up. It actually, even the way that their temples were aligned were east to west. And so when the sun would come up, it was very important. The priest would open up the doors and the sun would come through there, and they would have some sort of display in gold. And so that was very important, because they saw that as a blessing, that when the sun came up and it was able to shine in, the god Ra was there. And this is Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's responsible for this. So that's why. Now the next one then is death, because again, we're looking at the god of Ra that is supposed to also take care of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh himself is not protected. So it's the progression of the firstborn that is going to continue to go. And so let's pick up in verse 1 of chapter 11, this final plague. Now, Lord said to Moses, one more plague I will bring on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he will let you go from here. And when he lets you go, he will surely drive you out from here completely. Now, that's something we need to look at, because, before, there's negotiations that go on. And when he gets done with this one, it's no. I don't even want to talk to you. It's like, just go. Get out of here. So God is showing to Moses, which is going to give him confidence. It's the other thing. Moses is kind of learning and growing himself spiritually, because we've watched him from the burning bush, not knowing how to interact with this God, to now, whenever they first came to Egypt and he went before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh just turned it on to the slaves and made it harder for them, and the people complained to them. And then Moses is like, oh, Lord, what's going on? I've done nothing but make it worse. So these as well are building faith of Moses and his confidence in his abilities. So one more, he says, and then you're going to be driven out. We're done. This is going to be it. So now he instructs him. He says, now in the hearing of the people, that each man ask from his neighbor, each woman from her neighbor, for articles of silver and gold. The Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Furthermore, the man Moses himself was greatly esteemed in the land of Egypt, both in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, notice that, and in the sight of the people. So what's happening? It's getting to the point where that's why, over this extended period of time, I'm just going to say, over 8 months or so, that they're watching. The average person is watching and observing what's going on, and they're starting to accept that this Moses is legitimate. And I think the providence of God in lending that favor, that the people are having this positive effect. And what we see now is not only, we look at this transfer, but really this transfer of wealth is another plunder. It's not a plague, but it's another punishment, because they're already broke. The nation is broke. Everything from their crops to their livestock, they're going to go into a recession, a depression, and it's just going to get worse for them. But this wealth, there's going to be no negotiations with it. when it comes to the wealth and what's going to happen, there's not going to be, well, just take this or that. Nope. No negotiations with it. And this wealth transfer is, how's it going to happen? You're just going to have to ask. But you notice here, we're also seeing something from the Hebrew side. We're seeing where the Hebrews, as they're going through and experiencing all of these, they're on the outside watching. And now, guess what? They're participating. They've gone from one who is also building faith and watching what this God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has done, and the God of Moses, in case some of them are still kind of wondering, and they're watching him and they're building their faith. Now we're going to see where he said, now you need to go and ask. God could have set it up to where it said, oh, by the way, when you get a knock on the door, open it because it's going to be an Egyptian with some money. Right? I mean, he could have said, they're just going to bring it to you. But you notice he doesn't say that. You need to go. It's the women and everyone need to go and ask. That's all you have to do. Just ask. And so we say, why? Well, they're motivated to give. And I think it's interesting. We'll talk about it a little more. So anyway, that's another part that I think we kind of forget about, another aspect of punishment. It's very fitting. It's very fitting as we continue in this. So Moses said, thus says the Lord. Now he's speaking to Pharaoh. About midnight, I'm going to go into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of the Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstone, all the firstborn of the cattle as well. So now, it doesn't matter what social class you're at, whether you're a working servant. He's going to go on and even talk about even the firstborn that's in prison, all the way up, and also the firstborn of cattle. You're starting to pick up something about firstborn here. This is a shadow, isn't it? This is a shadow. And we'll talk about it as we get into more detail, but there's something here that as he takes the firstborn, there's something about the firstborn with God. And so even the cattle, so they've already lost a lot of livestock, and now they're going to lose the firstborn. Many times the firstborn is the one you use to breed others because they're the healthiest, the youngest, the best of stock. And so, we'll see that. So this is another severe blow. And I thought it was interesting as well. He's already devastated the livestock. Now he's going to devastate the people, firstborn, and the livestock again. And I think it has to do with the shadowing of looking at the sacrifice that's going to be associated with the Passover. And that's possible. Moreover, there will be a great cry in all the land of Egypt, as there has not been before and shall never be again. But against any of the sons of Israel, a dog will not even bark, whether against man or beast, that you may understand how the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. So the other ones, remember, Pharaoh sent inspectors out. He sent people down to Goshen, and he saw that they're not being affected by some of these devastating plagues. They're being overlooked. But now he's saying, this is going to be without a doubt. There'll be no doubt. It's not going to be a geographic location. You're going to say, well, maybe the blood in the water didn't get quite down there. Yeah, maybe the gnats, some reason, they were repelled. They don't go there. But now, no, this is going to be human lives. And I love the way it says, but not even a dog's going to bark against them. In other words, there's absolutely no threat at all. And why is he doing that? Because he wants them to know very clearly there is this final and great distinction between the Egyptians, because of the gods in whom they've worshiped, and the one that God of Israel, who has this covenant relationship. And all these servants will come and bow down to me and bow themselves to me, saying, go out, you and all the people who follow you, and after that I'll go out. And when he went out from Pharaoh in hot anger. So he's saying, you know what? Even your servants are going to come and bow down to me. To this point, they haven't. They've gone and fetched him. And they're bringing. But the weeping, and this is going to be so final, that even his servants that only bow down to the Pharaoh are going to bow down to Moses. And he's telling Pharaoh that. your servants are going to show me honor. And you're going to demand and tell me to go out. You notice, what do y'all think about this idea there, the last, when he went out, Moses was mad. Why is Moses angry? Why do we know he's got a temper. So we'll see some of that later on, but we can see where he's not a pacifist.
He's done. It's like, I've given you, God has given you chance after chance after chance after chance. Now, when are you going to relent? Now your own people aren't even going to respect you anymore. They're going to come to respect me more than they ever have you.
How much more? Look what you've done. Look what you have done to your nation. We could have stopped with the bloody river, guy. But no, we could have stopped after the frogs. We could have stopped after the gnat. We could have stopped and been on our way, but you've continued. And I think there's another part. Now human children and lives are going to die. Remember, Moses is a lot Egyptian, isn't he? Moses was raised for 40 years. He's still, when he comes back to town, he's 80, but there's still some sympathy, I think, and empathy that he has towards some of the families of the Egyptians. And then to know that even babies are going to suffer because of your pride, that these people are going to die that are completely innocent. It's you, Pharaoh, that should be dying, not these children. And so I think that adds
innocent
to...
people.
Innocent
people, innocent animals. It's all about innocence, and it could have been stopped. You're right.
And you were the God, Ra, who should have been protecting them and giving them life and giving them healing, and you're killing them. You're actually responsible for it. Something interesting, well, let's go on. I'll get to, we got a lot of material to kind of cover anyway. So what is the purpose? One, he says, is to show proof that God is superior, the God of the Jews. And I meant to get rid of that, change that. I don't like using Jews at this point historically, because they're not Jews. They are, but Jew is Judah, the tribe. So when you see that up there, it's Hebrews. They don't get called Jews until they return from Babylon. So that's centuries down the road, and that's because only the tribe of Judah comes back. But anyway, I digress, but that's my bad. I should have fixed that slide. And the other one is to finally force Egypt to let them go, because they're just going to keep holding on. It's like somebody that just doesn't get it, that they will keep driving themselves down the road of sin and destroy themselves completely instead of letting go. And it's like, if God keeps going, it's going to be more than just firstborn. This is going to be much worse. So there's a part where it's like, this has to be the final. It's going to do it. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not listen to you, so that my wonders will be multiplied in the land of Egypt. This is kind of a side note, a commentary of the total effect and such of what's going on when he says this. He says, then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not listen to you, so that my wonders, what he's done, will be multiplied in the land of Egypt. Moses and Aaron performed all these wonders before Pharaoh, yet the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the sons of Israel go out of the land. So this final one as well is going to magnify all the other ones. It's going to kind of like being the icing on the cake. This is going to be the icing on the cake that's going to demonstrate it. And so now the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall be the beginning of the month for you. It shall be the first month of the year to you. So the calendar is going to change. And this is where we see, if you want to go crazy, the Jews have a different calendar. So we're in like March, April, I guess, in this time calendar. I have an example of it. But he's resetting it. We're also going to see where this is the first time that God is going to start calling them a congregation. So now God is already seeing where he's separating the people out. He's demonstrating that they're great, they're separate. He's going to bring them out, and he's starting to prepare them to become this new nation of people. and changing their calendar and making the significance, which will go all the way down. Well, they're still practicing it to this day, those Jews that are practicing Jews. So they have to come out. They can't stay there, if you think about it. They have to come out because there's nothing there in Egypt. It's some rich land. There's a couple reasons. One, God didn't promise them that land. He promised them another location. But the Egyptians, they just used them for cheap labor. They were constantly looked down on. They were feared by the Egyptians. The Jews could never assimilate. And so God is using this as a time in the Passover to really set them apart and set them up different from all, not just Egypt, but all the nations, the Canaanites as well. And so, again, this is really horrible. If you're sitting in the auditorium, if you're online, maybe you'll be able to see a little better. But basically, the first month is the one that's going to change. But they do parallel the feast days, and what we see is, and I'm just going to move on because that is terrible. I tried to divide it up, but then you lose the essence of it, of what it's about. But the months don't line up to the civil calendar as it does in other cultures that had it around there. And it's around really the different harvests, the early, the late, and it's going to line up with Passover, and then especially like the Pentecost. So anyway. Now he's going to give specific instructions that are going to be so important. And this is where he says, speak to all the congregation. Right there. Of Israel. So no longer are they just slaves, but now God is seeing them and calling them a congregation. So on the 10th of this month, Abib, which is the first month now, is like our January. He said, on the 10th of this month, they will each one take a lamb to themselves according to the father's households, a lamb for each household. Now, if the household is too small for a lamb, and he and his neighbor nearest to his house are able to take one according to the number of the persons in them, according to what each man should eat, you are to divide the lamb. Your lamb shall be unblemished. Male, a year old, you may take it from sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to kill it at twilight. So it has to be the perfect male, a year old. They're going to keep it for 4 days. And I don't know about you, but if I took an animal into my house with my kids, and then after 4 days of having it in our house, I'm sorry, it would become almost a pet, wouldn't it? And then you're going to kill it in front of your kids. I understand, farm, if you raise on a farm, you're used to, wringing chicken neck, and you're used to slaughtering animals and stuff, but you're taking something and you're bringing it into your house and you're caring for it. You're not going out on the 14th day out into the livestock pen, getting one that's perfect, and then taking it and then sacrificing it and eating it. You notice it's becoming what? In your house. Family. It's not one that's just an animal out there in the livestock. So it does. And I think that's why God did this, is because it's kind of showing that you have an attachment with this animal that is going to die for you, that had no reason to have to suffer through this. And the terrifying scene of a 3-year-old kid, a 2-year-old kid that has never seen it ever happen before. You talk about remembering that. I still remember the first time my dad field dressed the deer that he shot. Like it was yesterday. It was the grossest thing I'd ever seen to me. It was just disgusting, to watch him gut that thing out there and do all that. And then we had to carry it. And it was like, so I was thinking of that, and a little bit of thinking about a child, a 2-year-old child, or let's just say even a 1-year-old, maybe he's not quite understanding, but a 2-year-old child, to have an animal come into his house, and then all of a sudden you got to explain to them what we're doing.
And where it went.
Yeah. Oh, you're eating it. You're not just going to kill it. You're going to eat it. And you're going to eat it in one night. And everybody has to eat of this lamb.
Do you think maybe we're a little more sensitive to that than they were?
You know, that's why I kind of brought up the fact of how
Yeah,
the,
I think maybe we are.
it's like a rancher.
Because they didn't go to a grocery store to go get
No.
it. They're like us.
Yeah, I mean, you go get lamb chops today. They're in a neat little package, aren't they? Already wrapped. You know, it's like today when people talk about slaughterhouses. And if you really ever seen any documentaries on slaughterhouses, I mean, it's repulsive. But it's like, well, where do you get your McDonald's hamburgers? Where do you get this food? So yes, Gary, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm probably as guilty, and maybe that's why it bothers me. But there's still an aspect that if it was 4 days to a kid in a kid's mind is a long time. And to bring it in the house, it's different from all the livestock that you're used to slaughtering, you know, and being a part of food as well. And the other thing is, these animals, the lamb and the goat, were not, you know, for meat. They were for, you know, milk, or they were used for their hair. You would shear them, right? So it wasn't a staple that would always be, as far as what I understood from studying, that, you know, they ate lamb all the time. So it's like, no big deal. No, the lambs and the goats were a different type of livestock. They weren't like pigs, you know, or like cows, certain, you know, for purpose of slaughtering for meat. So it's not something that they would even eat. But yeah, absolutely. And I caught myself thinking of that too, saying, oh, come on, Ron, we don't do this. And so maybe it wouldn't be as sensitive. But I think for little kids, you'd still have to explain to them, you know, what's going on. And that's a part of that integrated teaching that the children of Israel are passing on, right? And showing them and watching and learning and then knowing how to do it themselves. But now this is where, moreover, they will take some of the blood and they'll put it on 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh the same night, roasted with fire, and they shall eat it with the unleavened bread with bitter herbs. So you're going to take that blood and then walk out at your doorway and put it on the 2 doorposts and a cross. Some have said that's kind of symbolic of a cross, the blood of a cross. I mean, you're talking about blood across the header of the door and on the side, the post. Either way, you're looking at blood being displayed publicly out there and seen. And you notice that it's in the house in which you're going to be eating that lamb. You can't take, in other words, blood and go to your neighbor's house and put the blood on their doorpost. You need to be in that house of where that blood and where the flesh is being roasted, and you have to eat that. And what you don't eat, he's going to say, you know, and you don't boil it with water, but rather roasted with fire, both its head and its legs along with the entrails, whole. And you shall not leave any of it over until morning. And whatever is left of it in the morning, you're going to burn it with fire. Now you shall eat it in this manner. This is how they're going to be prepared, dressed for the occasion. He says, with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. This is the first time they've heard that. We hear it all the time. We say it all the time. So they're sitting there, firstborn all are going to die. Wow. And we're going to take this lamb in for 4 days, and then we're going to kill it, eat it, and put blood out on the door. And then he says, this is the Passover. So that, like I said, this is the first time they've kind of heard this concept, the Lord's passing over. For I will go through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against what? Look at this. Against all the gods I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. The blood, here's the purpose of the blood, shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So those who are not under the cover of the blood are going to be judged and destroyed. So what do we call this? A passing over is a vicarious type of an atonement in place of or in lieu of something else. And that's what we see, literally passing over. And I know some people, maybe you're not as in tune with this part, because sometimes we forget the importance of that idea of the judgment passing over us. And of course, we see the Lamb of God is Jesus Christ. He then becomes our lamb, and the blood, which is atoning for us, the perfect sacrifice, the same type of deal, then God's judgment passes over us. And it's only through the blood of the Lamb of Jesus Christ. So the instructions, and this is Nisan, before the 14th of that month, they got to get rid of all the unleavened. Now later on you can read historically about how they went a little, like everything, a little zealous, but they wanted to make sure. I mean, they would literally just go through the house, clean the house, specifically to get rid of that leaven. The leaven was symbolic of sin. You're getting rid of all the sin and preparing yourself for it. On that same day, they're to worship. Worship on that day. And then on the 14th as well, then they have that Passover meal. And this is the same pattern. They call it the Passion Week, the week when Jesus came in or during Passover. This is the same pattern that they maintained throughout the times they were faithful anyway. And so the only bread they can eat was the unleavened. Now there's some other sense to it. They're not going to have time to sit around and wait for it to leaven if they were to do that. But the bigger symbol was the idea that there's no leaven of sin, that it's more of a purity type of an idea. So from the 14th to the 21st, no bread at all. And on the day of the 21st, they were to worship. And they do. We see that. And it came about midnight that the Lord struck down the firstborn of the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was no home where there was not someone dead. Wow. If you were to take a family tree, and I've seen sometimes people do that, and look, there's not a family that wouldn't have somebody that's killed. And then if you have, like myself, I have grandchildren. And so not only would my firstborn son be killed, and then that would affect his wife and his children, right? And then his firstborn would die if he had children. So my grandchildren, my son, firstborn son, one of my grandchildren would die. And then each one of them, the ones that weren't the firstborn, but their children. So every one of my children, my three boys, would die. And then every one of the firstborn of them, my grandchildren, would die. I mean, to include all your animals, but it's like, how do you deal with the dead? That many dead.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
We have natural disasters, don't we? Where we have, hundreds of people. We're talking thousands of people. And we talked about, like in COVID, remember? The funeral homes.
They were just stacking them up in backs of semis.
There were so many that they couldn't even perform funerals for months. They were stacking them up in freezers, and they were like, they couldn't embalm them fast enough. It took, I don't know how many months to just prepare a body. So, this is a very horrific issue. I don't think we can appreciate it. It's how bad this would have been. There's nobody that wouldn't have been affected. Everybody's going to be weeping. You can't even console one another because you've got one another to cry about. You've got your own. It's just devastating families. And it's not going to get over. It's not going to be something, it's going to be a national weeping for a long time because those family members are going to be gone. and they're always going to have that mourning. So then Moses, in the middle of the night, calls Moses and Aaron at the night and says, rise up, get out of among my people, both you and the sons of Israel, and go worship the Lord. As you have said, take both your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and go and bless me also. The Egyptians urged the people, send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we will all be dead. So they took their dough before it was leavened, and they kneaded their bowls up and bound them up in their clothes and their shoulders. Now the sons of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, for they had requested from the Egyptians articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing, and the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they requested. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. So this was done. Now remember, this was done between the darkness and then the last born, but this is a retelling of why they did what Moses had said, so they were ready. They were ready to go. So his response to this is, take your people, take your flocks, and get out. Go now. And I think this plundering is retribution. It's reparations for, think about how bad they were treated. And they need the money.
Yeah.
I know they didn't have Walmarts. They weren't going to stop at a pilot truck stop and, have to fuel up and stuff, but they still were going to have commerce, and they're a nation. And they're going to have to be able to buy goods and food and stuff as they go out. So, and on top of that, don't forget about the tabernacle that they're going to build. So and it's just, again, remember, the River Nile was where he was killing the Hebrews in it, right? And God struck it. And then he struck the firstborn as well. And then when you look at the way they were treated, they were suffering, they were poor, and God brings them out and he gives them these riches that were from those worshipers of a false god. Some of the lessons, and then we'll wrap it up, but we look at it, is that, we forget that God does judge in real time. Now then we say, well, that's a special situation, but, no. We don't see or receive update from God on every judgment he executes on people or on nations. He doesn't keep us up to date. But again, if you've read the prophets, you look at the Old Testament, God's not saving stuff up. He carries it out when it's at the right time, and it is in real time. And the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews 9:27, he says, "And as much as it is appointed for men to die once, and after this, judgment comes." And we see that it creates, when people understand this, we see that it does. It creates a fear within them. And this is what the Egyptians had to unfortunately go through and experience, was they ignored their God, like Romans said, suppressed their God, made their gods into all these false ones because they didn't want to know the truth, and then they punished it. And this is where, like when Paul talks to Felix, when we look in Acts 24:25, and he tells Felix, and then that response from him studying with him, but he was discussing righteousness, self-control, and what? The judgment to come. Felix became frightened, and he said, "Go away from the present, for when I find time, I'll summon you." Yeah, well, Pharaoh delayed too, didn't he? He delayed a lot. In some very specific times in the New Testament, we see where King Herod, remember King Herod in Acts 12:22 and 23, when he went down to Caesarea, and he was down there, and he went into the auditorium, and he was dressed and arrayed, and everybody says, "Oh, look, he's as a god." And because he took that glory, God struck him, didn't he? We see Simon the magician. We see others, that where God strikes, right away. Ananias and Sapphira. So that's why, I'm very careful to not necessarily pick up on and say specifically all these little things are happening. But again, if you look at the Old Testament, you look at God, he has not changed. And so the biggest thing is we need to heed that warning when we look that God is he's very active in our lives, and he's very much going on. And Solomon even says in Ecclesiastes 7:17, he says, "Do not be excessively wicked, or do not be a fool, why should you die before your time? You know, there's a lot of people who live very wicked lives, and it comes back. And so to me, you know, when I think about it is, you know, heed the warning. But, you know, the other thing is pray for big things. You know, I don't think of one of those Egyptians when Moses rolled into town had any idea what great things were going to happen. They were wanting to be delivered. I don't think they could envision, or they might have chosen an easier way to do it, but the greatness in which God delivered them was proof without a doubt. And also the way he brought them out with the riches and everything they did. And so to me, you know, like Matthew records in Matthew 19:26, when Jesus said it himself, in them looking at Jesus, he said to them, with people it's impossible, but with God all things are possible. When we look at these miracles and we look at all that God's done, there's nothing impossible. Everything is possible with God. And that's one of the greater lessons of that. So within that, any comments or closing thoughts? I'm getting kind of fast and furious. I don't see anybody out there. No comments. So before we conclude, let's go ahead and have a prayer, and then we'll wrap it up. Our most glorious Father, thank you so much for this time that we've had to be here together and to worship you and to study your word, to look at the way that you have provided for your people, that you've carried out your judgment, that you've demonstrated without any doubt that you are the one true God. And then the warnings that we should look at as well is not to try to create and give glory to something that is insignificant, that is something that you created, but to look to you and all these wonderful things that we see in nature and around our lives and give it the glory to you. You are the one who's created it, you've blessed us with it, and we should glorify you with it. We pray that as we go out the rest of this week, that we would be confident in our faith in you and what you're doing for us, glorify you for the blessings we have and the great blessings that you are bestowing upon us, and the greater blessings that we have to look forward to. We ask all this in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. Hope to see you Sunday morning, 9:45, 10:45 for worship, 4 p.m., and then next Wednesday. All right, God bless.